we can get started. More people are streaming in. I think it's testament to this issue and this moment that folks are still entering the waiting room, and that 300 people are here right now, just hours after we invited you to come and listen to us, learn from us, and ask us questions about what is happening right now in Israel. It's a huge moment in Israeli history, in contemporary Jewish history, in contemporary politics. There's many things we don't know yet. So the 500 plus questions that came in from all of you about what's going to happen in the end. Spoiler, we don't know that yet, but there's a lot that we do know. And we're going to share with you that today. We'll also share with you some of our recent experiences in Israel and discussing and encountering this issue on the ground with Israelis. So before we jump in, I'll just say hi. I'm Philissa Cramer. I am JTA's Editor-in-Chief. And I was in Israel for a month until Friday morning. It was hard to leave knowing that something big was about to happen. I was based in Jerusalem when I was there. And so even harder knowing that something big was about to happen exactly on the streets that I walked all day, every day. And we have with us the real expert here, Ben Sales. He's our news editor now at JTA, but he previously has been a reporter at JTA, including in Israel, and based in Israel. And Ben is right now in Tel Aviv, though this morning he was in Jerusalem. Covering this whole situation would have been much more difficult without the new-ish light rail. So we can certainly say that. So Ben, you filed your story today that folks can read if they haven't yet, about the experience in these massive Jerusalem protests. You filed it from a cafe in Gan Sacher in the main park in Jerusalem, where we actually sat down a few weeks ago on a bucolic afternoon. Really no shouting or tent cities to be seen. Things have changed a lot in the last couple of weeks and even in the last couple of days. So I'd love to just start by hearing from you about your morning and what you saw and what you experienced and the questions that you left with.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm glad that so many people have signed on to have this conversation. Thank you, Philissa, and thanks to all of you. It's certainly a crazy time here. Just in case the time difference isn't intuitive, it is 11:05 p.m. here. So if I am anything less than articulate, you can blame it on that. But this morning I was in Jerusalem, and the past couple of days, my family's been here for a few weeks. We're going to be here for a few more weeks. And like Philissa said, we used to live here, and I was JTA's Israel correspondent for 4 years, about a decade ago. And all of our friends here are just texting us and saying, like, you picked a crazy time to come, which feels accurate. What's interesting to me is that most of the protest, the kind of focus of the protests that have been happening for about 7 months now, has been in Tel Aviv, and I've been to a few of those. I went in April when I was here on a reporting trip, and I've been since I came back as well. The action today we shifted to Jerusalem, and the protests in Tel Aviv thus far, they've been happening at least weekly. They're upset about this legislative package that the current Israeli government is pushing forward. Certainly angry about that, but at the same time, there's this kind of like celebratory air. A lot of, without betraying the political leanings of our friends, some of them have been going to the protests. Some of them oppose them also, just so you know, but some of them have been going to the protests. And it's almost like a social event in addition to being a political statement. And today felt different in Jerusalem. there's a little bit of that and some of the same chants and T-shirts and slogans. But I talk to people about, like, what comes next for you, for protesters, if this law passed, which it did. And people, they were anxious, they were angry, they were despairing. And so today felt, it felt like less celebratory, certainly, and I think people on both sides of the equation actually are kind of searching for what happens next. The people on the right have passed one small part of a judicial reform they hope to pass, but if you listen to the Prime Minister's statements, he gave a statement tonight afterwards, he recognizes very vocally that there's this rupture in the country that he says he wants to heal and that he knows is not ideal. And the people at the protests who oppose him also talk about a lot about that. So I think what's on people's minds now, and you're seeing violence in the streets and on the roads now, and clashes and stuff. And I think people are wondering what's going to happen next, and kind of where both the protest movement goes and where the coalition, the government and its supporters are going to go. So uncertainty is kind of the word that keeps coming to mind for me.
I want to come back to the rupture. And I think we both have experiences with that we can talk about, but can we just catch folks up on like what exactly happened today? And
Yes.
Is this the whole thing that this right-wing government came in wanting to do? And do we expect more where do we stand?
Yeah, I hate to keep saying we don't know, which is going to be my answer for a lot of things here. But yes, to catch people up on one foot, as which is a popular expression here in Israel. At the beginning of the year, soon after retaking office, Netanyahu and his coalition partners embarked on this huge project to enact what they call judicial reform, and what their opponents have given a number of less laudatory names. Which the gist of it is that it will, if passed, if enacted, will dramatically weaken the Israeli judiciary's powers and the Supreme Court's powers. And just in brief, the reason the right feels that is warranted is because they feel that there has been a lot of judicial overreach over the past few decades. And if you look at polls and certainly election results for the past 20 years or so, more than that, a majority of the country, certainly a majority of its Jewish citizenry, defines itself as right-wing, votes for the right. And yet the right feels that in a lot of different ways, and I can go into them later, but in a lot of different ways, they've been stymied in their desire to enact their vision for the state. And a kind of corollary to that is that, and again, this could easily be the subject of an hour or 10 hours, but like the leaders who founded the state were largely secular Ashkenazim of Eastern European descent. The state, the majority, it's hard to tell now because there's a lot of there's been a lot of marrying and mixing, but like a large portion of the Jews in the state are now Mizrahi, of Middle Eastern and North African descent, and Mizrahi Jews did face a lot of discrimination in the state's early years, and there are still a lot of claims of discrimination, either obliquely or directly, nowadays. And for the supporters of this reform, one place where they see Mizrahim being excluded is in the Supreme Court, where, just to give one data point, the first Mizrahi woman on the court was appointed only last year. So that's kind of a sign. And so the supporters of this reform, of this overhaul, which is the word we generally use for it, say that limiting the court's power, limiting what they call judicial activism, and giving the government more power over judicial appointments will correct both of those things. Now, the opponents of the overhaul have a variety of complaints that really boiled down to the fact that Israel doesn't have a constitution, and because it's a parliamentary democracy, the executive branch, that is Prime Minister Netanyahu's office and his cabinet, automatically have a majority in the legislature, which is the Knesset, the parliament. And so if they take away the power of the Supreme Court, and take away its independence, they kind of control all three branches of government. And so you'll sometimes hear the anti-government protest being called pro-democracy protest, and that's why. Because they say that they're fighting for democracy and for separation of powers and checks and balances. I should also note that Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption, which is obviously germane to the Supreme Court and to the judicial system, which he has been no fan of in recent years. So those are kind of the factors at play. They unveiled this plan to sap the court's independence and power in January. It sparked this massive protest movement, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets every week. It's been sustained for basically since early January, so coming up on 7 months. And it got so raucous and the unrest got so severe in March that Netanyahu pressed pause on the whole thing. He said, we're going to enter into negotiations with our opposition, and we're going to see if we can come up with something moderate. And also President Biden and a variety of other world leaders have cautioned him against enacting the reform as it was proposed. So there was this pause for a few months. I'm sorry if this is a bit verbose. There's this pause for a few months. It ended a couple of weeks ago, and what Netanyahu and his government have passed today is a measure that would basically bar the Supreme Court from striking down decisions by the government, that is Netanyahu, his cabinet, and individual cabinet ministers. It would bar the court from striking down decisions by that government that they deem unreasonable. So the reasonableness standard, which is the focus of this bill, has been used for to strike down a number of different cabinet decisions over the years. The most recent one is that they wouldn't let Netanyahu appoint a close ally of his who has been convicted multiple times of various corruption offenses to be interior minister, because he's had that position in the past and has used it to be corrupt. So that person is Aryeh Deri, by the way, who's the head of the Mizrahi Sephardi Haredi Shas party. But basically the court wouldn't let him be named minister. That's the latest in again, a series of decisions that they've made on the reasonableness standard. And again, not to rehash, but like the government says that this is curbing judicial overreach. The opponents say, okay, now this is going to let the government this is going to remove a huge curb on the government being able to do like anything it wants and appoint anyone it wants. And those are kind of the stakes here. So sorry if that was a little long-winded.
No, I think it's really helpful to get caught up because this has all moved really quickly, and there's a sense that, oh, this piece is off the table and this piece is on the table, and there's a compromise on this, or maybe they're talking about that, and to know what's actually happening is hard to pin down. So I think everyone here, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure that everyone here appreciates getting caught up. So just to reiterate for everyone, I didn't say this and I should have actually. You send in questions ahead of time, but you can still drop your questions in the chat. We'll see them. And a really good one came in. Ben, you gave one example of an extreme situation in which this standard and the law passed today would make a difference around whether someone who's been convicted of financial crimes can be appointed or whatever to be appointed to a position in government. What are some other examples of what will be different, what could be different, like starting tomorrow because of the law passed today?
Yeah. So again, there's been a list in the past. I don't want to go down it. You can look it up and probably find more articulate renderings of it than I could give you right now. One of them in the past was that I believe they mandated the government to like provide more bomb shelters in the towns surrounding the Gaza border. They said it was unreasonable to expect Gaza residents, I believe I'm getting this right, but please don't quote me on it, that it was unreasonable to expect either Gaza residents or a certain subset of them to make it to shelters in the time that the government had set out for them. So that was one. In terms of moving forward, and certainly there were others as well, but moving forward, the main concerns that I've read about today and in the past are being able to appoint ministers who are either unqualified for the job, or who, like Derry, have a criminal history. The reasonableness standard has been used for that in the past. I think not just this year, but in the past as well. And people are worried about that. Another thing that people are worried about is that this will give the government a freer hand in firing the people that have been called gatekeepers in the Israeli press. So that is the Attorney General. It's different than America. It's not the same thing. It's not like the Attorney General in America, but it's kind of like a legal advisor that that issues legal opinions on laws and government decisions. And other people that I've seen people say this law puts at risk are the police commissioner, and other people like that who are kind of like not quite bureaucrats, but like in professional positions, and rather than being political appointees. And so people are worried that this will allow ministers to fire those people and bring in political appointees and kind of damage the professionalism of Israel's government in that way.
Those felt a little narrow, and I think in our coverage up to now of what the Supreme Court, the role it has played in Israeli society, we've covered how, for example, LGBTQ Israelis have experienced Supreme Court being a protector of their rights in a climate where the right-wing majority would not favor their rights, right? We've talked about and done some reporting about protections provided to non-Orthodox Jews and where that's been a real source of conflict between the right-wing governments and the Supreme Court. The role of women is another question. And so, does this decision today start to affect that or not?
That's a good question. It's a question I've been trying to figure out. And can I come back to this? We don't exactly know yet for a couple of reasons. So the text of the law, at least as I've read in Hebrew, does not define what reasonableness is, what falls under the scope of being reasonable or not. So that's an open question as of now. And it's possible that through redefining or whatever, narrowly defining, that could either widen or narrow the scope of this decision. Another thing is that there's a right, so this is the reasonableness clause of the way the Supreme Court renders its decisions. And there are several other clauses it uses. One that's mentioned a lot of proportionality, which is more limited. There's a bunch of others. I don't want to get too technical about it, both because I'm not an expert in that specifically, and also because it would be, I think, a little boring. But basically, there's there are other measures the Supreme Court can use that are more limited in scope to question or strike down laws. But I want to speak to your larger point, which is, for both sides, the significance of this is not just in the terms of the law that was just passed. Certainly, the right wing is celebrating it as allowing them to legislate. They believe, better legislate according to their voters' wishes, and their opponents certainly believe that this is, very damaging to Israel's democratic standing and to checks and balances and the separation of powers. But the reason why it has sparked so much raucous protest and why the government is so determined to pass it is because both of them view it as not only a law in isolation, but a first step toward a larger thing. I mean, So Yariv Levin, who's the justice minister and the architect of this broader plan, literally called it a first step in his valedictory speech after it was passed. That's true of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister, who's on the far right, and I believe others as well, but certainly those two. And that's also the case with the political opposition and the protesters, who both think this is bad and worry that this opens the door now to a larger judicial reform that they oppose. So they're worried about how the government may use this new law to enact to pass decisions that they believe are anti-democratic or that they don't like, and also that again it could lead to the wider changes that were in the initial plan that really would sap the power of the Supreme Court. I'm not sure I mentioned them. So just in brief, it would be giving the government, I think it did say this, giving the government full control over at least a number of judicial appointments, if not all of them. And the second thing that Netanyahu says he took off the table, but these things have been very much in flux. The second thing was a law that would allow a bare majority of the Knesset, the parliament, to override any Supreme Court decision. So those initial versions of those bills were voted on months ago. It's unclear exactly where they lie now, but those were the two huge pieces that caused, that caused the civil conflict months ago.
We've had about 30 questions in the chat now, about 100 earlier, about this scenario that feels very plausible that in a few months or however long it takes, the existing Supreme Court might strike down this new law about reasonableness as unreasonable. And I'll just say yesterday I joined Israeli expats and their allies in New York City in doing a protest march here. And I walked next to one person who said, look, I'm protesting today, even though I know we've lost for now, but when the Supreme Court reviews reasonableness, one of the things that they can say is, this obviously has a lot of support. So I'm showing support for that. And I think at that point, it'll be okay because they'll be able to overrule this. And then I walked next to somebody else who said, the nightmare scenario is in a few months, Supreme Court reviews this, declares it not unconstitutional, but illegal or unjust. And that's when the civil war really starts. Is that what's going to happen there, Ben? What could happen? What are people talking about?
So not only do I not know, but I wrote an article about this very question again in round one of this whole thing, I believe in February or maybe in early March. And I asked a bunch of Israeli legal scholars, and also they didn't know. And actually I reread it an hour ago because I was thinking, wait a minute, did one of them say what was going to happen? And I just don't remember. And the answer is no. It was a really long article, and nobody actually said who they thought would win out. They were all like, this is very scary, and we should never even get to this point, and it would be really bad, and it would be a catastrophe. So that was true across a variety of different people, of different political opinions. And also it's something that politicians have said in Israel, Netanyahu and his opponents and his supporters have all said, a constitutional crisis would be bad. So let me just briefly sketch out what that would look like. Government passes the bill, Supreme Court strikes down the bill, government doesn't respect that decision of them striking it down and acts as if the bill is still in force. Okay, right. So who wins? Is it the government or is it the Supreme Court? And not only is it unclear who wins, I mean, that's what a constitutional crisis is when you don't know who's going to win, a conflict between different institutions or powers. But not only do I not know who's going to win, but people don't really know who would decide that. What would the path forward be? Would it be security officials like the chief of staff of the army, the head of the Shin Bet? Is that healthy that those people are the ones deciding? Would it be decided via protests and an escalation of the civil strife that we've seen over the past several months? Is it something else? The reason why I'm asking all of these questions is because I don't know and nobody knows because it hasn't happened yet. And just one note about that is that Israel might have a constitutional crisis, but doesn't have a constitution. It's one of a few countries that doesn't have a constitution. It has a set of what's called basic laws, which act as kind of quasi-constitutional foundational principles for other laws, but they're also kind of passed the same way regular laws are passed. Anyway, there's no constitution. There might be a constitutional crisis. But yeah, a few NGOs like civil rights groups have already filed challenges to the Supreme Court to this law. They're expected to be heard, at least. I can't tell you what's going to happen because they haven't been heard yet. I did read something, I believe, in Yisrael Hayom, which is a right-wing pro-Netanyahu paper that had an explainer on this, and I believe that's where I read it, where it said that the judge who is presiding now is on the Supreme Court. It's a rotation, and the judge who's presiding now is one of the more conservative judges, and so the chances that this law is going to be frozen are low. Again, this is me quoting an article. I don't know if that's true, but yeah, there's probably going to be a court. I mean, there's going to be a court challenge that will almost definitely be heard, and we'll see what happens.
When you did that story several months ago about, Israel could be heading for a constitutional crisis, I think it's in the story. If it's not in the story, it was the backdrop of what a lot of folks were saying is like, sometimes crises of this nature can get resolved through institutions, and sometimes they things go bad. And this is the kind of scenario in which societies, communities, countries devolve into violent conflict. Their institutions break down or cease functioning. One of the people that I walked with yesterday, and I quoted in my story, was a diplomat in the Foreign Service. He lives in Brooklyn, and he worked in, I asked him, did you ever work in a place where, democratic institutions were under assault? And what did you experience? And he described, absolutely seeing that. And I asked him, I was just in Israel. Like, I went to the Aroma, I went to the park, everything seemed normal. Like, is it possible that a place like that feels like that, can become a site of conflict? And he said, I've seen it, it can happen. So that was pretty chilling. And I think that caused me to reflect on some of the things that I saw during my time there, where something that stood out, in a way that was, I hadn't expected, is I saw protesters and pro-government demonstrators having real discussions on the street. So where in our Airbnb, across the alley or the walkway was the neighborhood's main pro-government guy, and he had a big sign, and he would hand out stickers saying "End the tyranny of the Supreme Court." And he would stand at a street corner during the Saturday night demonstrations, and people would come up to him one by one and yell at him, and he would yell back. And my Hebrew wasn't quite good enough to get the entire contents of their conversations, but I could tell that it was tense, and then they left, and it was they parted on okay terms. And I saw that several times, which I thought was heartening. And I think this week we've seen, social media accounts of, all right, we were on the train together, and there's, anti-government protesters and pro-government protesters, and they were talking and they shook hands. I also saw at the end of a protest, a man come out of his house and scream, "When are you," to the police, "when are you going to shoot all these people in the head? Our country would be better if they were all dead." Mm-hmm. In front of children, and I saw some social media accounts that kind of correspond to that as well. And when you hear people say that, it becomes something you can imagine, right? Real violence. And Ben, I'm wondering, today, as the mood has turned, what were folks saying to you, or what's in your head about this?
Thank you. I would like to echo your experiences. They've also been mine today. I saw a couple of instances of that. People explaining their stances in civil conversations, who are on opposite sides of the debate, and also less civil conversations And then that was just this morning. So, but one thing I like to start with in my own thinking about this is that this might sound obvious. Israel's a really small country. Not a lot of people in Israel. I mean, there's more and more, right? There's almost 10 million, but like it's really small, and like that makes a difference, right? Like I've been when I was like a rookie reporter in like 2012, I was like this far away from Bibi, right? Like I had like cabinet members' cell phone numbers on my phone, like actual cell phone numbers, right? And that isn't to brag. That's like a normal experience among reporters here, right? Or just like normal, like people. It's a really small and intimate country, and that makes a difference with things like this. It makes a difference because people do talk to each other, and people have in their own. I mean, I think in America we also have the experience of in our own families having people on opposite sides of a political divide. But here, you see them on the street. It's not like even in Tel Aviv, which is like a the bulwark of Israel's left, right? Israel's small left wing, like they're all here, right? Even here, like I've had conversations with people where they're praising Bibi and complaining about the protesters and all that stuff, right? In that sense, I think it's hard for me to imagine like what we would imagine to be a civil war, right? On the other hand, like history shows us that people, Israelis have killed other Israelis, right? Over politics. I think most famously, Rabin was assassinated, which was a horrendous thing and is the worst possible outcome, right? And there have been other deaths as well, and it's an unthinkably terrible thing, unthinkably terrible. And I hope I can objectively say that as a journalist, that people getting killed is bad. So no matter who they are. So yeah, I mean, again, like I'm not predicting anything. I can't say. This does feel like a moment of rupture. That's a word I used earlier, and I think it's appropriate. I will say again, so I do read Yisrael Hayom, the pro Netanyahu newspaper regularly, and today the editor-in-chief, I think he's the editor-in-chief, Ariel Kahana, who's their most prominent name, wrote a column where he said, look, it was like addressed to the protesters, and he was like, look, when Israel withdrew from Gaza and withdrew its settlements, evacuated settlements and troops from Gaza in 2005, which was known as the disengagement, he said, I thought the country was dead. I thought the country was over. He said, I didn't know how I could keep going, and life went on. And actually, the right uses that parallel a lot. They say, well, you did the disengagement, and we thought that was terrible, and that was overreach, and you totally disregarded us, and like so there's been a parallel there that they've drawn, that the right has drawn a lot, and so again, like I'm not gonna. What I like to say about the way I talk about Israel is, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Mean Girls. This is, just stay with me on this one. So there's a scene where Amanda Seyfried's character says she knows how to predict the weather, like she knows how to predict whether it's raining right now. So I'm like that with Israel. I try to describe what's happening right now, which is getting really hard. So I can't tell you what's going to happen in a week or tomorrow or like 5 months from now or whatever. But yeah, I mean, people are scared of that. Like there was a poll a few months ago where a majority of respondents certainly said they were worried about civil war. The Israeli president, who is not known for extreme pronouncements, he's known as kind of a mild, consensus-oriented figure, Isaac Herzog, he said he was worried about civil war. So certainly it's on people's minds. What shape that will take or where it will lead, I'm not sure.
I mean, there are other risks in this moment, and one is that I think we got one question that said, what are the chances of, can you enumerate the chances of civil war, mass exodus, brain drain? And somebody I was walking with yesterday told me, it is the same guy who said, here's why I'm walking to give the Supreme Court credibility when they reject this law. He also said, he's in tech, and he said it's important to show Israelis in tech who contribute a lot to the economy that like they have allies. And he's doing that from New York, but the tech industry has been very active in the protests within Israel. And I think, a part of that is economic, and a part of that is deeply held beliefs, and a part of that, brain drain could be a real damage to Israel. So what do we know about that? I know, Ben, you've also reported about brain drain, or the exodus, or the fear of exodus, or the threat of exodus in the US when some American Jews here were dissatisfied with election results or fearful of election results. So your reporting may be informed by that, but what are the risks before civil war that we're worried about?
Yeah, I do want to mention one thing that's not brain drain that I meant to mention in my response to your last question, which is that the discourse at present in terms of violence is actually, I think, less focused on internal violence and more on this growing movement of military reservists who say that they're going to boycott their reserve duty because this law has passed. The number, at least as of a couple of days ago, was over 10,000. The Army does not release like its internal numbers, so I don't know what percentage of the Army that is or what percentage of reservists, but 10,000 people is a lot of people. And I like saying these obvious things in my responses. So, and they include Israeli Air Force pilots who have been long seen as the elite of the military, and others. The supporters of the overhaul are quite upset about this. They say the Army should be kept out of politics. And Netanyahu is really focused on this. He says that this is crossing a red line, and that it leaves us vulnerable. He says it leaves Israel vulnerable to its enemies. And then just so I can kind of cover the map here, people that support the reservists say that these people are risking their lives for this country, and they don't want to risk their lives for a dictatorship, and they feel like they're doing their duty, they're paying taxes, and why should they do that? And again, I'm going to bring up something that could be a very long conversation in its own right, but the strongest supporters, according to polls, of the judicial reform package are Haredi Israelis who do not serve in the army. Who largely do not serve in the army. There are some, but most Haredi men are exempt from the mandatory draft, which again is its whole long thing. But there's resentment there, right? Where the people serving in the military say, you're passing a law that we believe is damaging democracy here, and then you're asking us to go serve to protect the country, right? So all of that is playing in. And for the record, the leaders of the parliamentary opposition who oppose the overhaul have also said that they oppose shirking reserve duty. So that's kind of the stakes there. But a lot of the discourse here has been about this hurting the unity of the army, and in fact, the leaders of the IDF and other security forces have asked Netanyahu to press pause again, because they're worried about the army's readiness against the threats Israel faces. So now to the brain drain, a lot of the same people who serve so Israel has this vaunted tech sector, and a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is fed by elite units in the army, where people go into elite units either in intelligence or something else, or in cybersecurity. And then kind of go into Israel's tech industry. And so there's a lot of overlap. The Venn diagram is kind of close when it comes to like the people doing reserves and the people, or the people who served in sensitive roles in the army, and the people who are in tech, and the people who are wealthy and pay taxes to the government. So a lot of those people have said that they're going to pull their money out or they're going to move. I'm not sure what the numbers are on that. I'm not sure there are numbers yet for this year on that. Certainly there have been numbers on the financials, and there have been a certain number of companies that have moved their money out. Investment in Israeli tech companies has declined. I believe hiring has also declined over the past year. So interestingly enough, I spoke to one of the founders of Waze about that, the navigation app, a couple months ago. And he pointed out, he said, yes, that's part of it. He also said there's been a tech downturn across the world, so don't blow it out of proportion in terms of the Israel specific reasons. So again, it's a complicated picture. There aren't black and white answers, but certainly a large portion of the discourse has been people saying, I'm not sure I'm going to stay here. I interviewed somebody who works at a tech company today, and he said, like, what do you want me to do? You want me to like move my family out of this country? I live here, right? He's like, I'm not going to do that. And then he said, on the other hand, maybe I'll do it.
I'll say I ran into somebody, many of my friends are Anglos who've made Aliyah, but this person is Israeli and his family's all in Israel. And he said, I never thought I would think about leaving. My family's all here. I live in Tel Aviv. I'm a gay man. Tel Aviv is a great place for me. But everyone will feel it when it happens. And because I said, don't you think that, can't you imagine a scenario where like the government's doing its thing, but your life is kind of unchanged in Tel Aviv? And his response was immediate. I think I'll feel it and I'm going to look to leave. So I will follow up with him in 1 year and see where he is living. So you can't meet me, have a meal with me without me, harassing you about making sure you've been consistent in your beliefs, or if there's change or news in your life, I will find out. So my experience really for the month was that this was on the tip of everyone's brain. They'd really thought deeply about it. And we're really questioning whether some of their approaches to their relationship with Israel could be sustained. One of the things I heard someone say, this was an American rabbi actually, was that, and this raises a question that a couple of folks have asked. She said, you know what, like in this moment, where the terms of the conversation about Israel are so changed, I suddenly personally felt able to think about the issue of the occupation differently. And I'm going to go back to my community in the States, and we're going to talk about the occupation in a way that I never would have. I'm going to follow up there to make sure that really happens. So poor woman. But we got some questions about the effects of this change or this moment on both Israeli Arabs, Palestinians living in Israel, who are about 20% of the population, but also Palestinians living under occupation. What changes for all of them? But I just wanted to flag that conversation because I do think that there's a set of changes to life in Israel that could cause people to make different decisions about their life. There's also a change in the conversation that could have lasting effects in the way American Jews and others engage with Israel as well.
Right. I just want to go back quickly to the previous thing and say, just because someone wants to leave Israel and move away from Israel doesn't mean they can. There's the matter of citizenship and passports and visas and all that stuff. So some people do have that or can get jobs at tech firms and other places. A lot of people can't. So that's obviously a factor in that conversation. I just want to name that because that's obviously, and that also came up when I wrote that story about people moving to Canada, people saying they wanted to move to Canada in 2020, that like Canadian immigration experts were like, can't just like move to Canada. You have to actually, there's a process. So that's true when it comes to moving anywhere. So yeah. But yes, in terms of what this means for Israeli Arabs and what it means for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So I haven't done a lot of reporting on this, but we as JTA certainly have done some. And there's a lot of ambivalence from what we've reported among Israeli Arabs, they're certainly, largely not fans of Netanyahu and his allies. But some of them say like, oh, this is like a protest for Jews in Tel Aviv, right? Like we don't feel represented or seen in these protests. So some is, I mean, again, nothing is across the board. Nothing is true 100%. So there have been Israeli Arab public figures and leaders who have endorsed the protests, who have spoken of the protests. But I wouldn't say that like this is like a landmark moment of like Jews and Arabs in Israel coming together across lines to fight for a shared political goal. It really is like largely led by Jewish Israelis, and there's been some Arab Israeli participation, but not a ton. In terms of Palestinians, it's a different picture. The Supreme Court has at times delivered verdicts that have been favorable for Palestinian land or Palestinians, Palestinian claims. In fact, one of the reasons why some members of the Israeli right want to reduce the power of the Supreme Court is because they feel like it's placed too many restraints on their ability to expand settlements in the West Bank. So that's certainly relevant. Just in case this isn't obvious, Palestinians can't go to the protests, can't really, I mean, some do, but you can't really cross out of the West Bank to go to a protest. And they don't vote in Israeli elections. So in that sense, they're not, members of the same electorate. So yeah, like the implications, sorry, the Hebrew word popped into my head just now. The implications for this for Palestinians do exist, but it's not as direct of a relationship, if that makes sense. In terms of bringing up the occupation and anti-occupation activists and how this relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what was once called the peace process more broadly. Certainly the Tel Aviv protests have had a contingent of like pro-peace activists and pro-Palestinian activists. One of the shirts that I've seen, certainly not the most common, but like I've seen it at every protest I've gone to, is I think it's no democracy with occupation is what it says on the shirts. And that's those shirts are distributed by a Palestinian Israeli movement, a pro-peace movement. So yeah, I mean, there are certainly some people that see this as an opening, like I think they see this as like a moment when everything is being called into question, and now we're putting everything on the table. We're talking about everything. So now this is a moment for us to talk about the Palestinian issue and to reignite, the peace process and to start talking about that again. I actually talked to somebody who said that today, who said like people are realizing that there's a connection between Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a vehement supporter of the settlements, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who supports this court reform, right? And like, and she was saying people are going to see that there's a connection there. Again, like, I would not expect this government to enter into peace talks with the Palestinians. It's not, that's not where it is on that issue at all. But like I do think so something I was thinking about today, and this is a little off topic, but I think it comes back, is that the last huge, there was a protest movement against Netanyahu specifically a couple of years ago, but before that, the last huge protest movement in Israel was in 2011. Some of you might remember there was this big tent protest on Rothschild Avenue, which is a main kind of like it's like the place to hang out in Tel Aviv. It's like a main street with a lot of cafes and shops and stuff. And people camped out there and held huge protests there, protesting the high cost of living and the high cost of housing in this country, which continues to be an issue for Israelis, a bread and butter issue. certainly for Israelis. Netanyahu was prime minister when the protest started. Netanyahu was prime minister when the protest ended. Netanyahu was prime minister, the dates might be wrong, but almost a decade after the protest ended also, right? I think some people looked at those protests and said, they failed. There was no transformative change. I can tell you, because I moved to Israel in 2012, when we moved here and I became the Israel correspondent, I can tell you that between then and now, I believe housing prices have doubled, and that was a year after these protests. So the housing prices were high then, and they're like way higher now. So a lot of people say like, oh, that didn't work. But I will tell you that like when you talk to Israelis about this issue, the language they use is at least inspired by the language of that protest movement. And there were certain reforms in the government. So I'm not like out here saying that it worked and it changed everything. I'm not out here saying that it failed totally. My point is that these things sometimes have these larger implications and these larger ripple effects. And so I wonder if that's going to happen here. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to change the discourse around Palestinians and around the West Bank, but it's certainly possible.
We have some questions about the role of Americans here. And certainly we saw US Jewish groups really go out on a limb in some ways. They're, the centrist groups that have been very careful and had a real approach around not criticizing the Israeli government, that's for Israelis to do. Maybe they would weigh in on issues of religious pluralism that affect Jews around the world, but largely Israeli domestic politics for Israelis to hash out. They weighed in and expressed concern and galvanized their memberships or their audiences. And it's hard to identify the effect of that. So I think one line of reporting that we need to do in the coming days is to understand from the perspective of those groups, whether they feel they had an impact and what they're, how they're going to think about weighing in the future. But I don't know, do American Jews count?
Another topic that could just take hours of conversation, and that has been the subject of many, many books. So I want to hit on something that what's the wrong phrase? I want to touch on something that you said just now, which is that American Jewish organizations generally refrain from criticizing the Israeli government, except for when it comes to religious pluralism, when they at least in recent years, have been less shy to do. The Supreme Court has been a site where a lot of the biggest gains have been made in religious pluralism issues. So like in terms of Women of the Wall, certainly the Supreme Court, I covered that again years ago. The Supreme Court ordered that police had to protect them and had to let them in to the Western Wall area. There was actually just a Supreme Court decision on Women of the Wall that eased their way to bringing Torah scrolls in. And there have been other things as well. There have been other Supreme Court decisions that have advanced the cause of non-Orthodox Judaism, organized non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel, one way or the other. And so American Jewish organizations may be seeing this as like, this institution is our biggest ally in advancing religious pluralism in Israel, and if its power is sapped or reduced, then that could spell trouble. American Jewish organizations, to the best of my knowledge, have also been pretty out front in supporting LGBTQ rights in Israel, which, as you noted, has been another area where the Supreme Court has, not legislated, it has Supreme Court rulings have led to advances in LGBTQ rights in Israel. So those are two things, but also this is, the word unprecedented has become so overused in the past few years, but this is really an unprecedented moment in Israel for hopefully the reasons why that is the case are pretty clear to everybody now, but so, and there are a lot of people who are like, I never thought I would go to a protest, but here I am, right? Or like Biden saying over and over again, like, don't do this, don't pass this law, right? Like the idea that the American president would opine on what like technically is an Israeli domestic concern, right, is also out of the ordinary, right? He obviously views it as a really existential issue and an urgent issue, right? And I think that a lot of American Jewish organizations do as well. So that's what I would say about that. But like whether or not American Jews count in Israel, I think people are. It's a very complicated question, but I wouldn't say that like based on my reporting and what I've seen, I wouldn't say that American Jewish concerns are like a top driving factor in government decisions, if that makes sense. I think, Netanyahu has constituents and he has an electorate and he has coalition partners, and, it's a country that makes decisions based on, a lot of other factors as well.
So as you've said many times, Ben, we could spend hours talking about lots of different dimensions, and we really could. We won't right now. We will wrap things up right now for now, but there's a lot more coverage ahead. One question that we didn't get to that I hope that we will didn't get to in this conversation, I hope we will through our reporting, is what are the prospects for negotiation? Because right, that I think several people wrote, like, wouldn't it be better if like they could work it out and like come to a compromise? And why aren't more people talking about that? And there were negotiations that seem to have amounted to nothing. Netanyahu said today, okay, we did this piece, now let's have some negotiations about the rest. I'm not like a professional negotiator, but that seems like difficult starting terms. But I think that's an open question and one that we're going to follow and document. Another open question, and well, it's not really open actually, but there's a discourse that we didn't talk about that could be tapped into, is like, what do we know about Netanyahu that we didn't before? And his legacy in the story of his leadership in the country is very changed. Is there a way through that? Many questions about what can change and when, and how American Jews might start encountering those changes. All of those things are things we're going to cover. Please keep your questions coming. And we here, keep them coming here. You can always reach out to us by email. We'll see on social media, like probably it doesn't really work anymore, but you can try tweeting at us. I don't know if you're allowed to say tweet anymore, Xing at us. But we really want to hear from you. And it's a fast moving story, but one that I think, we all came today because we believe it's important, and a moment that we're going to continue to follow. So thank you all for dropping whatever it was that you were doing to come and listen to us. And we will look forward to staying in touch. And thank you, Ben, for everything that you've done today. Very long day.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming. I really appreciate being able to share with you. And yeah, please do be in touch, and please keep following this.